so much for having me here tonight. It is always wonderful to tap into Sandy's projects. The Bard School and the Mythic Mind series are fascinating. They're compelling, and as I'll come to after, as I'll start with and as I'll end with tonight, they're also incredibly important at this moment in time and at this place in history. They've always been important, but now more than ever. And part of why I would say now more than ever has to do with my own work in political economy of technology and cultural imagination. I should just add a quick footnote to some of the things Sandy said about me, because it'll give you a filter through which to process the things that I'm going to share. I have been specializing for the last 10 or 15 years in social media and politics. That happened by mistake in some ways. It happened by being here in DC and getting drafted into a number of early projects about what to do with the internet. I came back here in 1991 when the internet was just starting. But as a local academic, I got pulled into that. I apparently had things that people didn't mind me saying. I got pulled into more. Next thing you know, I'm an expert in it. The Encyclopedia of Social Media and Politics is the masterwork of that part of my research life. It's published by Sage. It's 1,600 pages. We had more than 200 authors pulled worldwide. And it, like I will tonight, takes both a very detailed look at how things actually work. That might be coming out of my film, television, and production and theater background. But it also, it's got bifurcated vision. So it looks very closely at how things actually work, but then it relocates those understandings within what I call the 37,000 foot view, the anthropological or sociological picture of events unfolding. So that's part of why when Sandy and I were talking about what I might share with you here in the Mythic Mind series, we settled on fake news, because the work that I've been doing on fake news is actually not limited to fake news per se. And the ex-president who shall not be named, incredible mastery of that. Of course, fake news hasn't gone away with the change of regime. It's just relocated its headquarters. But the way in which fake news worked so well, continues to work so well, and from my perspective, most interestingly, works well even when people know it's fake. Fake news often has an effect, it achieves its goal, even with people who know that what is included, what is carried in that news, that piece of news, or that targeted messaging is actually completely false, is completely inauthentic, is inaccurate, is false altogether. And that's what makes it the most frightening, is that fake news works regardless of whether or not you believe it. And the point that I want to make going into this is, as I started to say, that in my own work has extended to all kinds of messaging per se, particularly messaging that is cultural in a way that lays down groundwork for political sensibility. Politics in many ways actually is built on cultural sensibilities, some of which we have access to consciously and some of which we don't. And that's part of why this seems so good for Mythic Minds, is that myth accesses that part of our individual and our corporate or collective being at levels that the conscious mind either rejects or the conscious mind doesn't realize is up and operating, just as much as intention is up and operating all the time in the people we are, the decisions we make, how we move through the world. So even though it seems at first glance that some of the really detailed stuff I want to share with you tonight is a bit far afield from something like the Mythic Minds group and studying myth and the power and role of myth in modern times, it's actually, I think, a good bookend to what you all have been doing with Sandy so far. And it's a good bookend because it provides, to mix my metaphors, a behind the scenes look at how malicious players and bad actors, to borrow language from the conflict resolution literature, how malicious players and bad actors can actually co-opt what were never intended to be political apparati to achieve persuasive goals, to actually not even achieve persuasive goals, but change the entire conceptual framework within which we come to understand what the world means, how the world works, and our place within it. In other words, worldview or cosmology. Now, I'm going to draw from both the social and the hard sciences as I do this, and I'm going to move as fast as I can. So it's kind of like the speed dating version of a thing that is much a field of study that's really quite complicated, and complicated in ways that I am only starting to get my hands around now. I'm depending on work from a lot of other experts in separate fields of study that I'm trying to bring together in that 37,000 foot view way. But the in drawing material from any of the sciences, social or hard sciences, I'm not suggesting that this is the real way to look at the kinds of things you've already been looking at in terms of mythic minds. I'm not suggesting that it's a better way to look at it. It is just ironically, it is just that it's interesting that both the hard and the social sciences are giving us simply another way to discuss what myth has always known. And what myth has always known, as Sandy and I have been talking about for years, I wrote a paper on this, 15 years ago or so, and then he brought it to new heights in other areas. What myth has always known is that you cannot change a feeling with a fact. You can only change your feeling with another feeling. And that goes double for for phenomena that are rooted in deep feelings, such as power, the concept of power, which is, of course, at the heart of what you've been looking at in both strands of the Mythic Mind series. So thinking about the concept that you cannot change a feeling with a fact, you can only change it with another feeling, that brings me to the same place where you have been, which is that what needs to be changed is just as fundamental just as profound as the tools that we need to harness in order to change it. And what needs to be changed, as Sandy's described it to me, I think quite eloquently, is this idea of power. It's not that power needs to be adapted to something like the return of the goddess or the return of older ways of leadership in the person of, as they manifest in the person of a Celtic king, but that power itself needs to be reimagined and redesigned. And that brings us into straight into ways of looking at how in modern times power is created, it is claimed, it is stockpiled, it is hoarded, it is occasionally used. We're seeing it being used right now in ways that it may not have been possible before, but which would benefit for a little bit of retro design. By modern times, I should say that I'm talking about collective sort of global human existence since the development of big data and big technology and the subsequent intrusion of both of those phenomena into our everyday lives, both at the individual level and at the collective level. Intrusion in a way that actually then becomes normative, it actually becomes shaping within those lives. And that brings us straight to the material, right into the heart of the material I want to talk with you about tonight. First, a very, very quick overview of the intersection between the work I'm doing right now in the political economy of technology and cultural imagination, and the work that you've been doing for some time now on myth, leadership, and power. This work, this intersection happens at a crossroads, and at that crossroads we find, or at least I think we find, two questions that inform both roads leading to that shared place. If I boiled it down to its most fundamental level, the first question would be, why do people believe what they believe? How do they decide? How do people believe? How do they decide what is real? And the second question, more focused but equally profound, equally important, is why do people believe other people's versions of reality, even when they know that they are untrue? Why do people believe other people's versions of reality, other people's claims that this is a fact when those audiences know that it's untrue. The response to this, my response to this, and I'm not by any means the only person working in it. My response to this is to say, is to first begin by realizing or outlining, identifying 4 tributary streams that feed into, that create a confluence of a rushing, roaring, overwhelming torrent of chaos in the experience of everyday life at the individual level, and in the navigation of collective life at the level of organized units, whether those organized units be of governance, of religion, of economics, whether it be a parish, a jurisdiction, a nation, NATO, for instance. That is what I would argue is different about this set of chaos, this type of chaos, than the other kinds of chaos that we've encountered as a species before. We've certainly had no dearth of chaos, but in this day and age, there's 4 very specific things that I've pulled together from different subgroups, sub-disciplines in both the practice of politics and the study of culture, and political economy technology, which is a phrase that I made up to talk about the way in which that overlap happens. That set the background for what we're talking about today. Actually, it's part and parcel of what we're talking about today. So first, let me talk about very, very quickly those 4 tributary streams. The first thing to look at in this palette, the context behind which the technical stuff actually takes hold and has an effect. The first thing is the loss of public trust in institutions, including, but not exclusively, legacy media. Loss of public trust in institutions of all types. And we were talking earlier about things like Vietnam. It's been a long time coming, this loss of public trust. And we've had loss of public trust before. The American Revolution, sometimes I've heard it in England called the American Rebellion, is a great example of that. But this is a much more ubiquitous and a slightly more pernicious kind of deficit, I would say. So because that loss of public trust in things like legacy media, the medical industry, because it is an industry, education, certainly governance, all of those have been replaced by social media, either institutions or social media information streams in one degree or another. And we'll come back to that later, it's crucial. So loss of public trust in a way that opens the door for social media and all that comes with that to rush in. Second tributary stream is the information technology overload. I've heard it described by one writer as a constant fire hose of information that just keeps bombarding us every single day, every single moment about every single thing in all of our lives. And that would be a fire hose of information, of messaging that comes from our social media, which we consider our private, personal, chosen contacts, chosen exposures to the world, but also from those very legacy institutions who are scrambling to keep up with what social media has done on the replacement dimension. So there's too much to handle in terms of information and technology overload. And that opens the door, another door for other things to happen. Part of what's behind that overload, one of the authors of that overload, is the ability of big data to know each of us more intimately, probably, than the people we live with. And that is possible, of course, because big technology it does 2 things. It's inward facing and outward facing. Big technology provides big data with the data itself by constant data scraping, by data analysis, by following, archiving, and then drawing connections among every single thing we do, no longer just in our digital lives, no longer just collecting our information about our most visited websites, our that which we like, that which we friend, that which we get as RSS feeds. No, not just about that. Things like our playlists on Pandora, things like our bookmarks on our personal computers, and things that happen in what used to be called the physical world. It's now somewhat quaintly referred to as RW, the real world. You pay with a check, you pay with cash. The cash register itself will send information about that purchase particularly if it's by a check, because there's so much else about you attached to it, to big data collection projects. So I had an undergraduate who made an incredible salary in his junior year. He's probably 19 years old, by piecing together portraits of people based on the cookies they refused to have on their computer. So when you tried to opt out of being part of the collection process for big data, and this was years ago, you actually just had them kind of change the channel on what they would collect about you. That's how ubiquitous and how constant and how inescapable it is. So that's the collection part. The other part of it, of course, is the ability of big data to then contribute to messaging, even and particularly messaging of false information that would have particular and unique resonance to each of us separately, as well as particular and unique persuasion capability for us as members of the various groups to which we belong that constitute our overall self or identity. And then the fourth stream, and this is the one on which I'll focus in just a minute, is neuroscience and the cognitive sciences, neurobiology and the cognitive sciences, because there have been so many breakthroughs, particularly from the medical sector, but not exclusively, as we get more and more into artificial intelligence and robotics development. We're paving the way for that by trying to understand how human and other type of mammal brains work. So we have a whole lot of breakthroughs there with carryover importance to, and this is the bottom line here, to how humans actually process new information. And this is the surprise in that bottom line, and the somewhat unexpected roles of both ideology and memory in making sense of new things. And by new things, I don't necessarily mean a breakthrough in quantum physics or a cure for the coronavirus. By new things, I'm talking about units of meaning as small as a piece of fake news or a piece of content, a piece of messaging you might get on, say, a feed to which you subscribe. Somebody forwards it to your Twitter account. All of the amplification techniques we have attached to social media would be candidates for what I'm talking about when I'm talking about something new. So that brings us right down to the nitty-gritty. This won't feel sweeping and big and poetic and exciting the way working with myth does, but I would argue it's a necessary precursor to finding ways of applying what the work that you all are doing with myth to the world at large in a way that will have a positive effect on that world. So as we go, and again, this is a speed dating version of very complicated fields that are, like I said, I'm still trying to get my hands around, even in fundamental ways, but some things are very clear. And so as we go into looking at neuroscience and how it explains why people come to believe things they know are false, they actually know are false, how that alchemy, that malignant, malicious alchemy actually comes to pass, we begin with two things to bear in mind. The first thing is that there's a big difference between the mind and the brain. There's a big difference between the mind and the brain. The second thing is that messaging, whether it's fake news or false messaging, false content, messaging has to jump through a series of hoops, or in a different metaphor, climb a number of rungs on a ladder in order to move through the brain to the mind. And that's the really exciting place that we're starting to understand how certain processes come to pass and actually work. So information has to climb many levels of cognitive processing before it actually becomes absorbed in the mind as something like a true fact. Unfortunately, whether or not something was true to begin with is not one of those hoops and is not one of those rungs, whichever metaphor we want to use. The first rung, or the first hoop, is that something has to catch our attention. This goes back to what I said earlier about the information overload. And there's actually a phrase for it now. It's called attention economy. The idea that we just live, as I said in an NPR interview a couple of years ago, we're like bats. We live in a cave that is filled with screaming all the time. It's just that you and I don't hear it like bats would hear it. So something has to stand out against that constant background, not drone, but roar. And what stands out as new and novel has the best chance of climbing that next rung. Novel is actually a word taken from the neurobiological literature. I don't mean novel in the sense of the everyday use of that word. By novel, I mean unfamiliar. They use the word as something that the mind has not had to process before, something that pops up, which is unrecognizable. So that which is new, in the sense that it is novel, has a good chance of at least making it through that first hoop, climbing that first rung. But here's the kicker. The more unexpected, that's another phrase from the biological literature, the more unexpected, or in our terms, the more extreme, the more unrecognizable, the more outrageous the new utterance or message or headline is, the better the chance it's going to stand out. And that gives a leg up, that gives an advantage to the kinds of claims that are so outlandish to begin with. You'd think that the mind is, many minds, or brains, we're at the point of brains, would be predisposed to just ignore it. But how intention would work and how biology works, it turns out, are two separate things. So something new, some triggered material makes it past that first hoop and onto the second one. And this is where it starts to get, the neurobiology starts to focus on the biology. As the unexpected information makes it past that first rung on the ladder, so to speak, what gets pulled into play then, once it escapes the attention economy, new material becomes operated upon by different parts of brain architecture, literally different suborgans within the brain. One of the first parts of the brain that gets pulled into work here is the sensory cortex. And the sensory cortex is a part of the human brain that is very strongly linked to species survival. It's part of, quite literally, how humans as a species have stayed alive in hazardous and often lethal physical environments. It says, pay attention to this, pay attention to this, pay attention to this. And that part of the human brain has evolved to deal with irregularities. In other words, things that don't fit the pattern or that are unfamiliar, in exactly the same way that we just described. Triggering information has to conform in order to make it past that first rung. Now it's trying to make it past the second rung. So the reason that we say that the sensory cortex is involved with this is because it is looking at that irregularity, trying to decide what to do about it, specifically trying to decide, is this new thing in any way, shape, or form a threat? Is this going to be dangerous to me? So the sensory cortex is busy along with some other brain apparatus doing that. And while it's doing that, there's another payoff. This is a little bit of a cheap shot. There's another payoff. While the brain at this level, the second run, is scrambling to respond to novelty, something else is happening. The neurotransmitter dopamine is also being produced. Dopamine is a biochemical that's one of those feel-good natural drugs. Your body makes drugs for itself all the time. And dopamine is a feel-good drug. It is part of prescribed drugs. Synthetic dopamine can be part of doctors' prescriptions for a variety of different types of depression. It often is found in recreational drugs. It's even found, it's a very common type of drug, self-produced drug or artificially introduced drug. It's also it's the kind of drug that makes people violent when you make them try to stop playing certain types of video games. And we had an example of that about 4 or 5 years ago, where somebody with a lot of cachet actually got violent on an airplane when he was told he had to stop playing Angry Birds. It literally, just engaging in certain exercises creates dopamine, and the brain scrambling at that first level to make sense of something outrageous also creates dopamine. So you feel good while you're dealing with something that sounds crazy. There are structural changes so that's a biochemical change. There are structural changes that happen in the brain too, when it is confronted with extreme as well as novel types of triggering material. These structural changes happen slowly. They happen a little bit over time, but they do add up over time. And they deal with another part of the brain that is related to what we call plasticity. And I'm sure you know, plasticity is a way to describe the brain's ability to learn new things, to stay nimble and agile and kind of with it and learn new things. The part of the brain, technically speaking, some of the parts of the brain, the main parts of the brain involved with this are the hippocampus and the amygdala. The amygdala, so the hippocampus is a part of the brain that is most involved with plasticity because it's the part of the brain that is the orchestra conductor for creating synaptic connections. It says, oh, this is new. I don't know what to do with this. You over there may have some insight. This is the brain talking to the brain. I can't believe I'm doing this. You over there have something to add. Why don't you get together and talk about it, and we'll see if we come up with something useful in deciding what to do with this new triggering material. So synaptic connections are what keep the brain plastic. And that's by and large a good thing, except when what it's learning is that this thing which is not true, actually, it may think that it's learning that it is true. Part of that is because another section of brain architecture, the amygdala, gets involved at about this stage. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, and the limbic system, which is the brain that then gets attached to physiology, to body chemistry producing substances, is that thing that gets the bad rap all the time. If we were talking in Freudian terms, it would be closely related to the id. The limbic system is the lizard brain. It is it's flight, fight, or freeze, and it is an extreme part of the brain designed to deal with extreme situations. So limbic systems, lizard brain, let me just put it that way, lizard brain can override all kinds of rational things. And this is part of, now we start to see why fake news and false messaging start to get a foothold. If something really extreme comes up and the limbic system says, I need to pay attention to that, and I need to learn something to do with that. It can't learn what to do with that if it doesn't also find a way to remember it. That's where it starts to get crazy. All of this stuff that we've talked about, so now we're on the third level, the third rung, the third hoop. All of this gets high octane injected straight into it when that triggered material also has one of two or maybe both dimensions to it. If the triggering material is in some way related to pre-existing belief structures or ideologies, and or if the triggering material is related to belief structures or ideologies that are based on fear or anger or paranoia, which is kind of a combination of the two. Everything I've just talked about moves into a whole nother level of energy, a whole nother level of effectiveness. And an added edge comes in. So now we're talking about value added edges. We're at entering our fifth rung, fifth level of hoops, going from initial brain encountering to mind management of new information. It's even more effective when that information, that triggering information, carries what they call a moral emotion. Moral emotions are things that people feel righteous about, and they can feel self-righteous about them. And the self-righteousness, if it is also attached to a sense of personal danger and social urgency, adds up to the closest thing to a surefire way that information, triggering information, fake news, false messaging is going to make it to the jumping off point, to the interstice, to the liminal zone between first encounter, which is brain material, to embedding into a worldview, which is mind material. Ironically, the very thing that got the material to that point, the fact that it was novel and new, starts at this point, swings 180 degrees opposite and starts to become a different set of dynamics. Unfortunately, this new set of dynamics also, at this point, the momentum is up, is also moving the material into being believable, even though at first glance, the person seeing this material said, oh, no way, no way. So what happens here now is the material starts, that which used to be novel starts to become familiar. It becomes familiar because the brain has processed it, has moved it up the ladder. So it's been around, it's been hanging around inside the person's head for a while. But it can also become familiar because of, this is all happening inside the individual. It can also become familiar because concomitant with this, there is often repetition happening out in the world that keeps reigniting the original point of contact with that piece of fake news or false messaging. And this brings us to really, truly a horrific insight. Simple repetition actually begins to create credibility. The more something is repeated, even if it is still unbelievable, the more something is repeated, the more it begins to develop a patina of authenticity. To the point, now we're going to talk about, I'm not going to go into the details, but I've included some article citations for Sandy and you guys that do. Now we get into empirical lab things, into empirical work in this area. Not mine, other people's, but people that I would respect and trust and obviously use in my own work. Things really only have to be repeated 3 or 4 times before they start to develop their own homegrown credibility, before the people who are the recipients of this triggering information get to the point where they start to mistrust their own initial reaction to first contact. They say, you know, I've heard that before. I've heard that before. I can't remember where I heard it. That's communication studies. It's called sleeper effect, where you remember the thing, but not the source. I can't remember where I heard it. But, it might be true. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it might be true. And really, a number of lab experiments have made the point, they've come up with results that suggest there is a lingering effect to this lowering barrier of the conscious mind against newly information that is in the process of making itself credible through mere repetition. And that lasting effect can, so far they've tested it a few hours later, a few weeks later. I think there was even a really interesting experiment for our purposes in Mythic Minds that used, that did retooling of a Native American creation myth. And with people in an experimental setting, came back to it several years later. And it was the false information that was remembered, not the actual bones of the real myth itself. So repetition creates credibility, even for those things that are incredible to begin with. Because those things that are incredible have made it through those limbic system, sheer survival skill aspects of brain processing. And then the final nail in the coffin is a player we would probably not immediately think of as a villain, and that player is sleep. It turns out that our brains are very, very busy while we sleep. We know that because there's dreaming, there's often insight. If people are talking about visions, they often come during sleep, however you conceive of a vision to be. But we're also doing 2 other things while we sleep. And we only know this because now we can watch which parts of the brain actually light up with activity while we're sleeping. Sleep drives the final couple of nails in the coffin of resistance to fake news and inauthentic information for two reasons. The first reason is that our brains are very, very busy consolidating things while we sleep. What are they consolidating? They're consolidating things that have happened to us with things that we remember, with things to which we were exposed, whether they happened to us directly or not. So, and the brain is not very good at actually making distinctions among received experience, so messaging, so persuasion, messaging, images, and what Dilthey would call lived experience, things that we actually went through in our everyday lives, that we actually experienced firsthand. The second thing so this gets us to the situation where people can actually have memories of things that never happened to them. And if we go back to that very first of the four torrents, the four tributary streams leading to the torrent of chaos I talked about as an organizing metaphor, it was loss of trust, loss of faith in outside institutions. Who are you going to believe then? Who are you going to listen to? What are you going to listen to? What sources are credible to you in terms of drawing the picture of the world in which you live? You would start with yourself. You would have to start with yourself. So you are going to believe your memories, even if those memories were actually tweets that carried utterly incredible and non-credible types of information. But somehow in that last little bit, moving from the brain into the mind, which is somewhat of that's an organizing paradigm that I've developed, but it's roughly what does happen. You can't trust that. If you can't trust your own memories, and you know you have reason to, you're not in a specialty group, then who can you trust? You're going to start there. Unfortunately, the second thing the mind is busy doing while we sleep is it's busy prioritizing all of that information that it's then going to sort into threads, for lack of a better word. The same way that Google will sometimes sort emails into ongoing conversations, even if they're not real conversations among those people, but they're about that same topic. I don't know if you guys have had that experience. I have. It's led to some really awkward moments socially and some dangerous ones career-wise. So that's what our brain does. It prioritizes what's important and what's going to be the most important. What's going to be the most important is the stuff that is most extreme. So at the top of the line, the top of the ladder, the front of the line, we're going to find the brain then moving to consolidate the more extremist of any of the fake news or the false messaging that we've already gotten. And the brain will then make its own narrative out of that inauthentic raw material. So we go to sleep with the ingredients just getting thrown in the cauldron, although they've worked their way into different types of labeling, let's say. And then we wake up with a full-blown narrative that has us reluctantly convinced of things that when we first encountered them, we knew were wrong. But between the outside forces, and we don't have time, I'm happy to go into it maybe after the break, or I could do it now, but I'm sensitive to the fact that this is unfortunately a long, rather complicated bit of thing that I'm trying to share with you. Because of those outside forces about things like information overload, lack of trust, and where those lead, which is the imposition of both the self-imposition and then the subsequent technological imposition of various types of filters in how we actually even encounter the informational world in the first place, and the brain processes that we use to make sense of those encounters. At every step along the way, narratives are being created, and narratives could go in a number of different directions. But if left uninterrupted, the narrative that will result from constant exposure to the same fake news or false messaging will be a narrative that has created its own credibility and carries its own explanatory power about how the world works, how we inhabit it together, and what our individual places in it are. And that's what happens on the individual level. That's as far as we know right now. Again, it's an express stripped down version of it, and I apologize for that. But that's what happens inside people's heads. And part of why fake news worked so well and continues to work so well, even with people and populations who don't believe it. Our own survival mechanism, neurobiological survival mechanisms, in this one case, conspire against us to have us end up retooling somebody else's picture of the world, which is a kind of narrative, and archiving it within our own reference library of the way in which, of what is true and not true in that world that we co-inhabit, which is where you guys come back in. If what happens with fake news and false messaging is that inauthentic narratives are created and subsequently absorbed, even by those people who have the highest level of resistance to it on the rational level, on the rational side of things, the only way to interrupt that is by the creation of either counter narratives or alternative narratives that would engage that alchemized processing at some of the lizard brain levels. In other words, join the flow, join the fire hose. We have to find ways to join the fire hose of misinformation based on, again, remember, it's the most effective when it's based on fear, hate, paranoia, which often end up as blaming or otherizing kinds of paradigms. We have to join that fire hose with things that are just as powerful at both the unconscious, the subconscious, and the lizard brain, which is another way to talk about that level. And I can't think of any resource better positioned to do that than the kinds of things you guys have been working with. Thank you. Yeah, I'm putting together a lot of canned goods in the basement right now. I want to maybe, well, thank you for that, Sandy. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed the breakout room, although it's just every single part of this experience could be twice as long. And I would just absolutely love hearing from you guys. We were talking, Rosemary had brought up Ireland's response to Ukrainians and the crisis and welcoming the refugees who are just pouring in. I think I saw 5,500. I'm sure that number has increased exponentially in the last few days, people landing in Ireland. And for the St. Patrick's Day celebrations, Rosemary was also talking about the visual presence in ways that are both tactile and symbolic of those, not just the Ukrainians coming, but also the Irish open welcome to them. And that the word, what was the word besides hope, Rosemary, that you heard, that you brought up, please?
Peace.
Peace, thank you. And talked about how those are great and really important signifiers of the Irish reaction right now, but that it might be interesting to see as time continues to unfold and the situation doesn't go away. Now that people are there in Ireland, it's going to start changing things in ways that will cost Ireland, as well as speak to the notion of hospitality. And those costs might very well be outweighed by the humanitarian aspect and all of the, I'm sure, wonderful talents and abilities that this group of people are going to bring with them as people. But we had been talking before that about using myth, trolling, and we talked about some very specific ways to do it, but trolling the huge reservoir of world myth. In this case, it would be world myth, but probably if you want to use it as cultural messaging with that political subtext to it, that we're looking at as we move from an emergency situation to a long-term humanitarian situation. Particularly, we'd probably want to look at Irish myth as, you know, sub-reservoir there. It might be that what we can use as a mythic intervention in that movement from this is terrible, this is awful, we really want to welcome you, to the, oh, there are fewer jobs, things are costing more money, where's all the petrol? Things that Ireland will, my guess is, will rise to in a humanitarian way, but which will still complicate that moment of, but of course we're going to help. Of course, this is what we do. This is who we are. The thing about myth is it's always related to identity, both individual and group identity. And so Ireland's best self stepped forward in a way that was not replicated by every country involved, to help with the emergency, with the triage aspect to it. And we divided, looking at myth in the breakout room, we divided looking at mythic resources to develop fire hose interventions. No, that's not the right phrase. To develop counter narratives and alternative narratives to not just false information that found its way into messaging, but also negative information. Because here's the other kicker that I didn't go into well, actually this comes from the other side of things, the sociological side, not the brain side, although there are echoes of it in what we understand about how the brain works too. Remember we talked about information that is messaging components that are dangerous or are anger-based or fear-based, having the most octane, the most innate propulsion to move up that ladder of rungs that they have to move through in order to go from initial exposure to the brain to mental managing by the mind, mental embedding in the mind. It's also negativity that adds the competitive edge to a piece of material, a piece of triggering information as it moves through that, both that biological, the neurobiological process we just talked about in the first section, and the sociological part that I'll say a few words about in this section. But first, to get back to the breakout room. So we talked about using cultural myth both at the triage level and in a sustained way. And Rosemary brought up what was happening in Ireland, particularly today on St. Patrick's Day, which was fabulous. But as things move, as events continue to unfold and develop, it might be that it would be useful to plunder Irish myth in particular, not plunder, search Irish myth in particular for movement from the kind of narrative framing that is happening now to the kind of narrative framing that non-malicious actors would like to see going forward as refugees become new residents. And what I mean by that specifically is that you guys are the experts in specific myth, not me. But just from the little bit I know and what I would imagine is the case, I'm sure there are myths, there are stories in Irish mythology that focus on rescue, on reclaiming. I'm sure there are gods and goddesses whose job it is to save humanity from itself, to actually be the stalwart presence within chaos. And those are the kinds of narrative forms. You don't have to go out and say this god or goddess in your tweet, but those are the narrative forms that will still nonetheless resonate culturally because of the mythic reservoir. And so it may be that a combination of those types of intentional messaging or replies to early in the food chain of a piece of false news is life, the replies to those can be drawn from that deep cultural memory that gets encoded in mythic storytelling. But as refugees turn into new residents, it might be that a shift is needed from the and can be affected from that category of Irish myth to another category of Irish myth that might deal with hospitality stories, hospitality to strangers, and then move from there. So first you have rescue, then you have hospitality. Then you could move into acceptance in the tribe, as every cultural group has membership criteria, and they're different. They're all different. There's often different levels of membership. This is the anthropology speaking now. There are often different levels of membership. But the Cherokee, for instance, a Native American, a First Nations group here in the United States, I'm sure you know that, Cherokee, often there was, once you were adopted into the tribe, there was no difference between biological genesis and the moment you became a Cherokee. You actually were reborn as a completely adult human being. That was not the case with every Native American tribe. So there must be, I would guess there are mythic resources that deal with rescue, that deal with hospitality, and that deal with membership that can be retooled into interventionary narratives, a phrase I just made up, into interventionary narratives for use in this particular situation with the Ukraine. And that was based on Rosemary's observation about now and soon in terms of Ireland's really remarkable and laudatory reaction to what's happening in Central Europe right now. And that's one of, so I'll come back to that in a second. This is a good time for me to say to you guys while we're all together. So this is all the stuff that we're doing and that I'm talking about now is actually part of my research that I'm in the process of publishing on. So you're getting sneak previews of things that that hopefully will be coming out both in a series of web TV things, but also in academic books. And that's the coin I trade in. You please feel free to use them, but if you anything that is helpful to you for my talk today. But if you do, I would ask that you just give me a footnote or credit me casually if it's in conversation, because I will need to be able to claim thought that this particular transdisciplinary approach to materials for my own life going forward. So just please feel free to use it, but please do reference where it came from, and then build on it and make it better on your own, because I know you can. Just a couple of words then, Sandy, since you've asked me to do it, and I'm thrilled that you have, about the other half of what I wanted to talk about today. When we talked about cognitive processing and why that makes both individuals and populations vulnerable to false news, fake news, and false messaging, even when they know it is fake news and or false messaging. The stage for that in some ways is set by, and the whole thing is bracketed. What happens inside the individual is bracketed, is part of a stage that is set, is propelled forward, is amplified by sociological and political and cultural factors, by what happens outside the individual. This is similar to how people are now studying things that we thought we knew everything about already, such as the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials are, you're familiar with those culturally, I'm sure. They've been explained away by individual phenomena such as hysteria. They've been explained away by exclusively collective phenomena such as misogyny. But actually, we're now the current thinking on that is it's both an inward-looking and an outward-looking set of dynamics that made that thing possible. Same is true for what we're talking about with the efficacy of false news, fake news, and false messaging. So, in terms of getting back to the second two of those tributary streams with which I kind of opened the discussion today. The first one, of course, is information overload, and the second one, this is third and fourth, and the other one is is the role of big data and big technology in creating the landscape where those interior processes could actually not just happen, but happen regularly, and then have an effect, escape the individual, and have an effect on collective sensibilities as well. And the minute you have a collective sensibility, you have something to do with politics. So we start with the information overload idea. People just have too much information to wade through. There's that fire hose that just knocks us down all the time. And there's more information all the time. So more and more, they rely on filters. You can't process everything. So you have to decide remember attention economy? You have to decide what you're going to look at, which means, conversely, you're also deciding what you're not going to look at. And that's just as important as what you do look at, particularly because of how there's a domino effect among different sets of filters that get created and subsequently imposed in terms of just literally in an innocent way, very practical way, trying to deal with too much to handle in terms of information flow every single day. So what we do then is we create these filters that whittle down this constant information overflow. There's an attempt to manage the overflow. They may not present themselves as filters. They may present themselves literally as choices about how you want to use, particularly your social media, but also your relationships with legacy media. So, for instance, at different times in my life, my landing screen, when I turn on my internet connection, has been CNN, the BBC, and The Guardian. Those, just that choice is already me deciding what legacy news source I'm going to go to in order to get my overall picture of what's happening in the world today. And each of those different news sources is going to feature, let alone headline, slightly different, if not in some cases radically different, types of events, content, perspectives. And that holds true, that basic principle of every selection is also a series of deselections holds true for all of our moments of interaction with the outside world that comes to us through both legacy and social media. So every time, so all of the management functions that we use in our social media are actual content filters. Every like, every friend, every unfriend, every follow, every RSS feed, every bookmark that you do on web pages you go to regularly, every single one of those things, but particularly the earlier ones, every single one of those things is both a selection and a deselection choice. And how do we make those selection choices that then by default make deselection choices? This is where it gets a little heartbreaking. We make them according to things that interest us. Seems incredibly innocent. They're the things that interest us. They're the issues that concern us, the things that delight us, the places we like to go, the places we wish we could go, the people we are interested in, the people we trust, the people we don't trust. A lot of people follow people they don't trust, but that creates sort of an extremist bipolarity in what they cover and the choices they make in terms of exposure. And by making choices about what information we're going to let ourselves be exposed to based on that which we already are interested in, what do? We narrow our world. We start to make it so that everything that's going to come to us speaks to our cognitive and social biases that in the aggregate create the identity we inhabit. The biasy is not the same thing as prejudice here. Biasy is that I'm interested in this, but not in that. I've never been a vegetarian and I probably never will be. I don't need to look at that part of TikTok or that, well, this probably wouldn't be on TikTok, that part of Facebook. However, I would really like to learn how to grill a better steak, so I might look over here. It can be that innocent, but it's usually not. It's about things like parts of the world we're interested in, conflicts, things along those lines. So every time we make a simple choice about what to see, we are projecting into the information environment who we are. And that gets picked up then, actually it gets complexified by the fact that we have then created an information stream that just reinforces the picture of the world we already carry in our heads. So how else do we decide who we're going to let into that information stream, particularly if it's something like news? Well, that gets back to the very first of those four tributary streams. People don't know who to trust. There's a loss of trust, a lack of faith in all the institutions. So if you can't trust the institutions you used to trust to tell us what was important in the world, what happened in the world, what medicine is going to kill you, what medicine is going to cure you. Should I really never eat that again? Should I always eat that? That's horrible. I hate that. All of the things that are informational signposts for living life day to day. If we don't know who to trust about those things or about the big things in life, what we trust, if we can't trust organizations, we trust people we know. We trust people we know, and we trust people who look like they might be people we would know. We trust projections, again, that are reflections of our own worldviews, our own belief structures going into those things. And so if we trust, I have an outline actually, so I don't waste your time. If we only trust the people that we know or the people that look like us, we have imposed now a second, possibly a third set of filters on the world that we see. We have chosen what we're not going to look at by choosing what we are going to look at. We have chosen who we're going to specifically. Now we're getting more and more specific all the time, not just the kinds of things we're going to look at, but the actual individuals we're going to look at. And then we're going to trust people who seem to not just look like us or feel like us, or maybe they don't look like us, but we dial into their value system as well. They're part of our ideology. At least they're part of our emotional reality, if nothing else. And so it's not that we go out and we weigh evidence to decide who isn't and isn't going to give us factual evidence. We go out to decide who we're comfortable listening to. And once we make those initial decisions about our information, they call it the information mix, the media mix, then where big technology gets into it. And it gets into it in two ways. It looks at the decisions we have made and says, providers, big tech providers, look at the decisions we have made, even if the ones we didn't know were decisions, like what websites we look at to buy a new winter coat. And it says, oh, well, if you're interested in that, you might be interested in this. And do we not start to get proactively information sent our way by other players in the technology environment that either extend what we've said we're already interested in, or give us more of it. This happens on Amazon all the time. You buy one thing and immediately it pops up, oh, you might also be interested in this. It happens on every single web streaming TV station. You look at Outlander and next thing you know, they're telling you how to bake haggis. You might want to do you bake haggis? You might actually take a look at this documentary. You're interested in Scottish things, so this would be good for you. So that, and we only have so much time and so much attention in that attention economy to be able to invest in anything, even the things we choose to invest in. So now we have lessened our world, made the world smaller by our own choices. Technology takes over, big technology vendors take over and make the matter worse by saying, okay, if you're interested in that, here's more of that same thing to look at, okay? And then technology gets crazy with us because it starts to take the data scraping capability that Sandy was talking about when we first started, and I talked about a little bit too. It takes that data scraping thing and says, oh, you're not just interested in these things, you're afraid of those things. And you really want these things. You lust for these things. And these things terrify you. And so we actually start to be the recipient of incredibly customized messaging that can be political, it can be commercial, it can be ideological, it can be economic, it can be any one of the usual suspects of sociology and anthropology, but it is incredibly targeted to not just who we are, but the shape of our scars. It is targeted to the things that motivate us the most strongly. And as we saw from how the limbic system is an unseen architect in so many of our attitudes and subsequent behaviors, what we fear is often a stronger motivator than what we love or what we want. What we want often is attached to what we fear, unfortunately. So now, not only do we have all this stuff to look at that's all drawn from a world that has fit our perception of it from the very beginning, but the only expansion in that world, the only expansion of that social media or informational landscape comes from players, actors, who have a secondary agenda involved in that expansion, which is not an expansion. It's like changing the aspect ratio on a media screen, on a movie screen. It's not anything, it's not a wider picture. We're still looking through the same little tiny people. We're still in what they call the same echo chamber that we helped build for ourselves and that technology picked up and ran with. But because we have more sources, we feel like we have more information. All we have really is more sources of information based on the same set of assumptions and cognitive biases. And then talk about the nail in the coffin. And then here's the crowning touch on that. If we reach out in this dystopic landscape that I've just described, informational landscape that I've just described, if we reach out for believable information from people we know or from people who we feel comfortable with because they seem to share our value systems, they seem to be like people we would like to know. How awful is it? How terrible is it when those people turn out not to be human at all, turn out to be bots? Bots are automated social media accounts that impersonate human beings. They sound like people. You don't really look at them. They like Twitter. They like Facebook. They're text-based, so you can't really tell. But they play a huge role in both in the sociological, the outer-facing landscape I've just described, which then it's very pernicious because then it seeps into all those inner brain processing dynamics we talked about at the first part of this talk. Bots are huge. Facebook estimates that 126 million Americans were exposed to information via bots during the 2016 election that actually came from the current thinking is Russian sources, Russian misinformation and disinformation sources. 126 million people. A similar statistic from a different group. Like I said, I'll give Sandy the citations for all of this. From another group is that in that election and possibly all of the time, up to 15% of all Twitter accounts are not human beings. They're bots. They're deliberate messaging apparati that exist to serve political, corporate, or ideological agenda. And the thing, and okay, so that's fine. We call that advertising. But this is different than advertising. It's different than advertising because it capitalizes, it exploits that social phenomenon that we're at in this moment in history, where there is a lack of faith in things that are not advertising, in things that are at least have on the surface accountability built into them, some degree of transparency built into them. Bots rush to fill the credibility gap that is left by the lack of faith, the loss of faith in the defining institutions of global society. And as such, they're imposters. but they're imposters that if they enter the public conversation at the top of that conversation early on, they then set the parameters of debate for the entire subsequent conversation. And conversation is just like attention. If you're talking about this, it means you're not talking about that. So if bots enter the conversation, and bots are very good at replication, that's what going viral is. You're successful if you and your bots get to go viral so that the same fake news or false messaging is repeated endlessly in multiple social media venues. Then not only do they get to define reality in that brain cognitive processing kind of way, but they also get to dominate the topics of discussion and debate in public governance, in public life. Bots are not exotic. You and I can create bots right here, right now. One estimate I read said that it's very easy for a single medium level savvy social media user to create something like 11,000 bots in maybe an hour, hour and a half. Every single social media vehicle you have attached to your phone or on your computer right now has a function that is a shared interface user function. And that's where you can create a message, false or otherwise, that will get sent out and replicated endlessly throughout your contacts, and then their contacts, and then their contacts. It will go viral. And it will go viral in a way that has the potential to change human history. But it's not even a human being who's doing it much of the time. So that's the bad news. But the important realization that provides the second half of why fake news and false messaging work so well is that there's a perfect storm of unfortunate conditions happening both inside that it taps into, inside of literally individual cognitive processes that is reinforced, reflected, repeated in another perfect storm of sociological, political, and anthropological conditions on the outside, which again brings us back to the importance of myth. Because as Sandy noted in the interstices here, only something like myth is going to resonate at the wavelengths, to borrow from John, the wavelengths that people will attend to in that crucial first cut of novel information. And once they do resonate to it, it will feel familiar, which will get them past that movement from brain to mind at the end of the brain cognitive processes before it becomes embedded in the mind.
Right.
So,
Kerric, can I suggest we might go into breakouts literally for 10 minutes? And I think the theme now might be how could we scrape Irish myth? What could we work with within Irish myth? And I can already think of a few, but how could we, within the context of what we're addressing, Irish myth, articulate a myth to counter a myth, or to counter all the stuff that we've been frighteningly having our limbic systems and dopamine activated horribly. So what within the Irish mythic corpus could we work with? Because some of you have been working with us for a couple of years. So 10 minutes doing that, and then we'll come back and pull it all together, because we do have to wrap up at 9 o'clock.